Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Tanushri Chaudhary from Netaji Subhas Institute of Technology, NSIT, University of Delhi. Today we are going to talk about words, texts, cultural structures and narratives with reference to Ronald Barthes, Arnold Kettle and Harold Bloom. In the latter half of the 20th century, literary theory was at its height. Ronald Barthes was an important structuralist critic who analyzed signifying systems in mass culture and later on turned to post-structuralism to claim the death of the author. He wrote From Work to Text, theorizing the concept of the text, which was an important advancement in the field of post-structuralism. Arnold Kettle published his authoritative work, An Introduction to the English Novel, which traced the English novel from the 18th century to the modern period. He analyzed the canonical writers of the different periods through historical context and socio-economic factors. Amidst the rise of literary theories of Marxism, feminism, new historicism and cultural studies, Harold Bloom emerged in defense of traditional literary criticism. He presented a theory of poetry in his book, The Anxiety of Influence, a theory of poetry, and defended the canon in the Western Canon, the books and the schools of the ages. Ronald Barthes was a French literary theorist who straddled the line between structuralism and post-structuralism. His aim was to show how ideological propositions were presented as something self-evident and natural in mass culture. Even as a structuralist, Barthes had his suspicions regarding the representational sign. He believed that signs which presented themselves as natural and thus as the only way of perceiving the world were ideological in nature, as ideology functions by naturalizing itself as self-evident and unchangeable. In Barthes' view, realism is responsible for passing off representational sign as reality itself. Realist literature attempts to convince the readers that they are perceiving reality by concealing the fact that language is a construct itself. Barthes propounded a double sign which would point at its own material existence while conveying meaning as well. In the death of the author, Barthes became increasingly aware of the limitations of structuralism. He moved towards post-structuralism. In 1967, he wrote his landmark essay, The Death of the Author, which targeted traditional literary criticism's focus on the author instead of the author's output. Barthes contended that the author is a modern figure, a product of a society insofar as emerging from the Middle Ages with English empiricism, French rationalism and the personal faith of the Reformation. It discovered the prestige of the individual, of, as it is more nobly put, the human person. He further posited that capitalist ideology attached great importance to the person of the author to commercialize literature. Criticism further cemented this idea by focusing all literary criticism around the life of the author. According to Barthes, Milan was the first in France to see the necessity of substituting language for the person writing it. It was language itself which spoke or performed instead of the author. Barthes takes the example of Proust, who was concerned with the relation between the writer and his characters and attempted to blur it in his writing. Further in the essay, Barthes states that the act of removal of the author completely transforms the text. He draws a parallel between the author and the modern scripter. While the idea of the author is permanently attached to the creation of the book, the modern scripter is born with the text. Writing ceases to be representational and becomes performative. The modern scripter, cut off from any voice, becomes by pure gesture of inscription and not of expression, traces a field without origina which at least has no other origin from language itself, language which ceaselessly calls into question all origins. In the conclusion of the essay, Barthes discusses the concept of the text, a topic he would elaborate on later in the essay. From work to text, Barthes states that a text does not have a single meaning but multiple interpretations that blend and clash with each other. The text for him is constructed from multiple writings drawn from diverse cultures which enter into relations of dialogue and contestation. The multiplicity of the text, Barthes claims in the end of the essay, is finally focused on the reader instead of the author. In the essay From Work to Text, Barthes posits his theory of the text. He begins by observing that a change is taking place in the conception of language and the literary work that is created with it. The difference between work and text is not material. The work occupies space and can be seen, while text is a methodological field and speaks according to or against certain rules. You can hold a work in your hands, but the text is held in language. Text cannot be contained in literature or a division of genres. The text resists classification and pushes the limits of enunciation. While in work, the relation between the signifier and the signified is evident, in the text, the signified is deferred. There is a perpetual generation of the signifier in the text because of disconnections, overlapping, and variations. While the work is moderately symbolic, the text is completely symbolic. The text is plural. It does not have a coexistence of meanings, but an explosion or dissemination of signifiers. The text consists of citations, references, and cultural languages which cut through it in all directions. The work is seen in affiliation with the author. The author is regarded as the father of the work, and we are taught to respect the intention of the author. While the work is imagined as an organism that grows by development, the text is to be imagined as a network. As the text does not have a father or authority figure, it can be broken and analyzed. The work has become an object for consumption. The text is able to separate the work from its consumption by transforming it into a play, production, or practice. The text requires the abolishment of the distance between writing and reading. While reading is simply consuming, playing with the text is a completely different experience. The text plays like a game or a score of music and demands a collaboration with the reader. The final approach to the text is that of pleasure. There is pleasure in the reading of the work, but this pleasure is merely consumption, as we can read the work but not rewrite it. The text, on the other hand, is bound to provide enormous pleasure to the reader. The text achieves transparency of language relations and works towards a social utopia. Roland Barthes' essays, The Death of the Author and From Work to Text, were landmark essays that changed the face of criticism. He was an important critic who started his work on structuralism and then went on to expand the study of post-structuralism. His essay, The Death of the Author, changed the focus of criticism from the author to the language of literature. His concept of the text was an important advancement in post-structuralism, which has led to the burgeoning of field of cultural studies. Now we begin to talk about Arnold Kettle. He was a Marxist literary critic known for his authoritative work, An Introduction to the English Novel in 1951, in which he traced the English novel from the 18th century to the modern period. His style of writing in the book is simple and easily understandable, as he aimed to reach the general readers and didn't believe in the use of jargons in critical writing. He analyzed the work of important writers like Defoe, Jane Austen, and George Eliot through historical context. He believed, like all Marxists, that a work of art is the product of socio-economic factors, but he also defended the literary canon and the value of literature in life. In An Introduction to the English Novel, which is divided into two volumes. The first volume traces the English novel from the 18th century to the Victorian period, while the second volume traces it from the late Victorian period to the 20th century. In the novels of the 18th century, we talk about Arnold Kettle's contribution. Arnold Kettle divides the novels of the 18th century into moral fables and picaresque novels. In moral fables, the writer of the novel begins with a vision or a moral truth in his mind, which he attempts to justify in his work. A good moral fable must be probing instead of static and should be connected with the realities of life. The abstract idea which forms the moral must be completely fleshed out in the novel. While the moral fable evolved from the morality plays in the Middle Ages, the picaresque novels were the result of the breakdown of the medieval world. It is associated with the development of science and journalism. The origin of picaresque novels can be traced to the 15th century Spain. The protagonist of a picaresque novel is an outcast or a rogue who rejects feudal society and its morality. He is a man without roots, living on his wits and often falling into adventures. The picaresque novels did not have a consistent moral attitude to give them a proper structure, but they continued a curiosity about the world. contained a curiosity about the world, which gave them an interesting depth. The Unfortunate Traveller is the most famous picaresque novel in English literature. Kettle contends that in the Middle Ages, when people lived in a feudal society, rulers and landowners were the only ones who had enough leisure and education to develop an art form. As their main concern was to maintain their ownership and preserve the status quo, they ended up producing romances. Romance entertained and delighted the rulers, while providing an escape for the poor farmers and workers from the drudgery of their lives. The literature of the age did not represent the sordid reality of the society or attempted to enlarge the consciousness of the people. Its aim was to distract the masses from their subjugation. After the bourgeois revolution against the feudal society, Kettle writes, the novelists of the 18th century explored the new world which opened up before them. The age was marked by a spirit of curiosity, an interest in the study of mankind, and an urge to document the everyday reality of ordinary people. Kettle analyzes Robinson Crusoe as a story in praise of the bourgeois virtues of individualism and private enterprise. The novel stresses the importance of social living and highlights the struggle of man in the mastering of nature. Kettle praises the verisimilitude of Defoe's writing and his attention to detail, which brings to life 18th century England in front of the eyes of the readers. The Victorian Age, in the chapter on the 19th century literature, Kettle paints a sobering picture of Victorian society. Kettle argues that the rise of the industrial capitalists led to the degradation of art, as they were against realism and integrity in art. Thus, the great novelists of the time strove to write realist novels and expose the faults of society. They deeply felt that the degradation of humanity in an increasingly industrial society and rebelled against it through the writing. Now we come down to 20th century literature. Kettle locates the literature of the 20th century amid imperialism, war and concentration camps. The complexity and uncertainty of modern life seeps into its literature. Kettle broadly outlines some of the important changes in the 20th century. A distinction arises between good literature and popular literature. The novels praised by the critics and the intellectuals are ignored by the masses, while the popular bestseller novels are held in contempt by the critics. The commercialization of literature causes a lowering of the standards of books read by the public, while the good novels are seen as pretentious and snobbish. Writers start focusing on specialized areas of their sensibility. A feeling of isolation in the society becomes a central theme, and an attitude of pessimism and despair hangs over the novels. The writers of the 20th century are unable to achieve a philosophy in the writing to tackle the dangerous issues of the time. An Introduction to the English Novel is a defining work by Arnold Kettle, which is studied by the students of literature all over the world. His detailed examination of the major writers of English literature through the analysis of historical context and socio-economic factors produced a Marxist interpretation of the canonical authors. The focus on one novel per author also gives Kettle space for an in-depth analysis and critique of their work. We come to section 3, where we are going to talk about Harold Bloom. Harold Bloom is an American literary critic known for his important work on the Romantic poets, his theory of poetry, The Anxiety of Influence, a theory of poetry, and his book, The Western Canon, the books and school of the ages. Early in his career, he defended the Romantics and restored their reputation after Eliot's criticism had sidelined their work. His book, The Visionary Company, a reading of English Romantic poetry, is one of the most extensive and detailed works written on the Romantics. Bloom presented his theory of poetry in his book, The Anxiety of Influence, which cemented him as one of the most important critics of his age. In the book, he advanced the theory that the writing process of poets is affected by the influence of the great poets before them. His book, The Western Canon, published in 1994, is an exhaustive work on Western literature. It was a strong defense of the Western canon, which had been under attack by the various theories of Marxism, New Historicism, Feminism, and cultural studies. Bloom opposed these theories and clubbed them together as a school of resentment. Bloom's critical work remains important, and his analysis of literature through the approach of universal humanism is still relevant to literary studies. In The Anxiety of Influence, Bloom theorized that poetry is the result of the anxiety suffered by the poets from the influence of great poets that have come before them. The contemporary poets of the age feel anxious that the poetry will never be as good as the poetry of the precursors, and that they have written all that was there to write about. Bloom further writes that all poetry is in fact a revision and misinterpretation of the poets that came before them. He divided poets into strong poets or weak poets. The poetry of the strong poets are strong misreadings of the poets before them, while the weak poets end up repeating the works of the precursors. We talk about the Western Canon now. The Western Canon was an attempt by Bloom to preserve the canon against the attacks of the theorists of Marxism, feminism and new historicism. It was also an elegy for the canon, as Bloom could see that its destruction was close at hand. The book focused on 26 authors that he thought were canonical and most representative of their nations. The 26 writers are analyzed with respect to the qualities they possess that make them deserving of being included in the canon. Bloom defends the canon against the theorists of feminism, Marxism, deconstruction and new historicism, terming them as a school of resentment. Bloom is against the politicizing of the canon, as he believes literature is a solitary endeavor and an exploration of the self within. While the school of resentment views the canon as a means through which the social elite suppresses the marginalized classes, Bloom argues that it is the aesthetic value of the works that grant them canonical status. He stresses on the analysis of the aesthetic value of literature rather than politicizing it. According to him, the primary concern of the literary critic should be the aesthetic value of literature rather than the historical or economic factors surrounding the work. The canon is dependent on the writer and the reader and the relation to the preservation of what is written. Bloom's use of his theory and his anxiety of influence in his analysis of the 26 writers he critiques in the book. Shakespeare is the main cause of anxiety for all the Western writers, including to Bloom, as he is the greatest of them. As he critiques all the writers, Bloom analyzes their influences and the ways by which they dealt with them. He traces the process through which these writers overcame their influences and gained canonical status themselves. The central concern for the writers is immortality through competition with the great masters who came before them. Harold Bloom's theory of the anxiety of influence is one of the most important works done on the theory of poetry. It had a powerful impact on literary studies on his publication and greatly influenced the criticism of poetry of that time. Bloom's The Western Canon was a strong defense of the Western Canon against the school of resentment, who either wished to expand it or completely destroy it. Bloom's arguments for the aesthetic value of literature and his ideas of universal humanism in the book are presented with great clarity of thought and breadth of knowledge. He defended the canonical status of the 26 writers in the book with insight and in-depth analysis. The book was a fitting elegy for the dying Western canon by one of its strongest supporters. We'll conclude by just saying that literary theory and criticism flourished in the latter half of the 20th century with advancements in structuralism and post-structuralism. The concept of the text became prevalent and provided a new means of analysis of literature and cultural structures. Marxist criticism analyzed canonical literature through the lens of the historical context and socio-economic factors, problematizing accepted notions. Harold Bloom rose in opposition to the theories of Marxism, feminism and cultural studies. He attempted to preserve the canon against its detractors and wrote in its defense. Thus, even as new theories were being propounded, there was a conflict between the critics of different fields in literary studies. For further details, you can log on to this EPG Pathshala and get help from